from China, and first of all, I want to thank Amir for inviting me to give a talk. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Well, okay. This film is very personal to me, and I'll tell you in a little bit my many connection to the film. When people ask me, where are you from in China, they've never heard of the city where I'm coming from. But now all of you should know. I'm from Yichang, which is mentioned at least 3-4 times in the movie, which is a very mid-sized city in the downriver of the dam. So the Three Gorges Dam project is actually located right in my city. And what happened in the film is in the upper level of the river, so those villages has to be flooded to raise the water level. So my city is in the down, like lower level of the dam, so we're not affected at all. But at the same time, for me, I used to work on the construction site as a tour guide for foreign tourists. So I have a lot of comments and dialogue with foreigners who doesn't understand why we're building this dam. And although my city benefited a lot from the project, economic-wise, the economy boosted up, cultural development, tourism, we attracted a lot of foreign investment into the city. But at the same time, all the stories, all the individual loss are dismissed by the public media. So for me, it's a very personal movie. And when I'm preparing for my talk, I'm trying to kind of explain myself from what I know so that I can connect to you better. Because I don't want you to treat it as a foreign film or a Chinese film. I think this movie tells a lot about a lot of common human conditions, how we deal with loss. So I think everybody could make this film personal. And I'm trying to put myself in your perspective. And I met director Jia Zhang in 2007 at Columbia University when he screened his first film, The World. I don't know whether some of you have seen it. It's a very good film as well. So I talked to him. He's a very humble and shy guy. He's very shy. He will, his face would turn red when he talked to people. But at the same time, I remember one sentence he said to the audience. He said that, I am braver behind the camera. And I do remember that, and I think hopefully we can appreciate some of his braveness in this film as well. So just to cut I prepare a lot in terms of, I'm trying to critique how foreign audience tend to treat foreign film, especially Chinese film. They're always trying to look for a master narrative. People sometimes feel like I don't really understand the film if I don't understand the political or cultural context. But for me, I think I'm urging everyone to kind of see the film as just a plain text. Even for me, when I see this film, I'm trying to put myself out of this Chinese audience. So I'm gonna skip that. So what is interesting to me about this film is actually the phenomenon of the stranger. Both San Ming, the main character, the male character, and Shen Hong, which is the female character, are strangers who traveled far from the northern China to Fengjie County. They're strangers to the county, but they're connected to the community through their lost partners. They're also connected, as I understand, by the common notion of loss. And I think that's the notion we can connect to the film as well. So I asked myself, why does the director choose to place two strangers into the side of the story? Is the first question I asked myself, which kind of leads me to sociologist George Zimel. I don't know how many of you have read his famous essay called The Stranger, in which he formulates the stranger as, not in the sense often touched upon in the past, as someone who comes today and goes tomorrow, but rather as a person who comes today and stays tomorrow. Zimel's analysis of the stranger as a social type centers on the paradox of distance and familiarity. The stranger is someone who is both the insider and the outsider of the community he enters. The stranger is marked by differences, but that difference is set within the context of a general similarity, the result of which is what Zimel calls to be a stranger is a specific form of interaction. In the context of this film, people who live in Fengjie are close to their community, their hometown, and their essential state of being. They're deeply connected by the commonness they share. They're from the same community, same hometown, that's one hand, and they're experiencing the same loss, and they're feeling the same kind of powerless on the other hand. This close, similar, and intimate relation of their being binds different people from the same community together. People there are essentially living in a very mundane and ordinary life, fully involved in everyday activities to sustain their living. They don't really talk about their loss, their feelings of situation, their sadness, their hopelessness among each other anymore. They don't talk about them anymore. I lived with some of the villagers before, during my high school. That was my high school. And they really don't talk about their experiences among each other. Everyone assumes their own role in life as the head of a demolishing company, as a magician, workers on the construction sites, prostitutes. They're very close to their life. And such closeness to life, according to Zemo, can be dangerous. We can also say that they're living an unreflective life, because reflectivity, or what Zemo describes as freedom and objectivity, requires a kind of distance and strangeness. That's why, kind of putting a stranger in this situation helps to reveal a lot of the things that they don't talk about. In other words, for this reason, for this reason, telling the stories about the people in the county through the lens of two strangers is, in my understanding, is the director's way of introducing reflexivity into a side that is so close up to its own intimacy. Therefore, I treat this paradox of familiarity and strangeness as the fundamental structure to the film. Being a stranger in a relation helps to reveal the underlying commonness that is otherwise lost in an intimate relation. The stranger, according to Zemo, has more freedom, independence, and objectivity in the social relation compared to the rest of the society he enters. In this very specific interaction, when the local people communicate with the stranger, they move from inside the society towards the outside through marking differences. By the same time, such strangeness often vanish when a larger commonness and generosity is discovered. For example, when San Ming and his co-workers, they're sitting in their bedroom, ask him, "Oh, you're from Shanxi," that's his hometown. And they compare the three gorges on the $10 bill with his hometown, the Yellow River on the 50 yuan dollar bill. At that moment, there's an intimate sense of both differences and similarity at play. And this opposition of inside and outside is the basis of our human conscience. And we can discover a multitude of symbolic and spatial layers in the film, which I will talk about the spaceship and my interpretation. On the subjective level, there's a complex layering of individual stories, memories, nostalgia, and spatially we see beautiful three gorges as the primary background against which we see and hear ruined buildings and their demolishing. The striking sound, the construction workers, echoes in the space. For me, it's like a clock ticking, like dong, dong, dong. I think for me, it's like tick, 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 counting down the days till everything disappears under the water. Generations after generation, people from Three Gorges lived there. They attended their farms, growing orange trees. That's the biggest income. Tea. My hometown has really good green tea. That's why tea is part of the four themes. And they work hard with their hands and sweats. And this place is so familiar to them. So familiar to the extent that it suddenly lost its familiarity. The UFO flowing over the mountain, the observed buildings suddenly taking off like a spaceship and flying into the air, and all of this really surreal and almost out of place spatial elements, for me, is just adding a really strong sense of strangeness to a place that people are supposed to be really close to. So how do we make sense of this kind of strangeness? Zemo said, strangeness rests upon the perception of a general similarity. The stranger is a symbol of our generic humanity. The general similarity, or the commonness, that connects all the characters and all the observed random elements together symbolically in this film, in my interpretation, is the practice of mourning. I'm not talking more about mourning in the anthropological sense, which normally refers to a cultural complex of behaviors of how people deal with death. I am looking at mourning in a more psychoanalytical sense, which, according to Freud, refers to the reaction to the loss of a loved person or to the loss of some abstraction which has taken place, such as one's country, liberty, an ideal, and etc. So in his famous essay, Mourning and Melancholy, Freud claims that the starting point for the development of both mourning and melancholy is the loss of a loved object. But different ways of experiencing this loss makes mourning a natural state and melancholy a pathological one. In mourning, the subject recognizes his loss and is capable of overcoming it. On the other hand, in melancholy, the subject is not capable to recognize his loss, which prevents him from recovering. In other words, both melancholic and mourner have to deal with and work through the loss of the object. What distinguishes melancholia from mourning is whether the person can work through the loss. Freud says, when the work of mourning is completed, the ego becomes free again. In mourning, it is the world which has become poor and empty, and in melancholia, it is the ego itself. So this being said, let's briefly look at how each character in the film exemplifies the process of mourning. Before I jump into my conclusion, that I think there's a lot of similarity between the stranger in Zimo's sense and the mourner in Freud's sense. And in this film, we see many different types of mourner. We see many different ways of working through the process of mourning. So I think I want to start with the motorcycle taxi driver, which is the first local person we encounter in the film, who takes Samin to his address, knowing that the place already disappeared under the water. I see this as an introduction of the general background, like people, the loss, as the common loss. Interestingly, we don't see any sadness from the driver. The address is under the water. My home is under the water. That's all he said. Although Samin is a stranger, but they're connected by the same kind of loss. Why didn't the driver tell him beforehand? He wants Samin to confront the loss, the same way he and many others confronted the loss. When the individual mourning is transformed into a collective practice of mourning, different individuals are connected by a larger general similarity. In this case, our strangeness to our own loss is diluted by our commonness with the outsider. Turning mourning from a private action into a collective practice signifies the subject's working through the loss. And the second person I want to talk about is Brother Mark, which is the guy who died under the pile of bricks. And I want to kind of use him as an example of nostalgia. Brother Mark, the cheerful guy who who became Samin's best friend, said when they were having, lunch or dinner together, he said that we're just not suited into this modern world. We don't fit in. That's what he said. His ambivalence about the present is shown through a strong sense of nostalgia he holds to the past. From his ringtone, it's a very cultural thing. The ringtone, like the Cantonese song, it's a very popular TV show from Hong Kong. It was really popular. And to the big rabbit, the white rabbit candy, I just want to give a little explanation. It's the most popular candy from my childhood, so from his childhood. So it carries a lot of childhood memory. The factory went bankrupt for many years, and then recently they started again because the nation has this general nostalgia to the things from the past. So, he represents nostalgia as a common modern condition, a longing for the past in the face of rapid social change and in the face of an uncertain future. Nostalgia is defined as the longing for a home that no longer exists or never existed. This feeling of loss and fantastical romance was identified in the 17th century as a curable disease, yet by the late 20th century had become the incurable modern condition. In psychoanalysis, nostalgia is considered not only as a longing for the past, but a longing for an idealized past, for a moment that never actually existed. The feeling of nostalgia is given by symbols or an object, or something that represents a moment past. In Mark's sense, music, TV shows about the past, candies that capture his childhood memories, becomes the symbolic objects that help him to fit into this modern world. Nostalgia, in this case, simplified recollection of loss or absence. What was once had or felt is no longer there. The symbols both remind us of what we have lost and provide us with a moment that we have once again. Is nostalgia closer to mourning or melancholia? Will Mark ever be able to fit into the present without the shelter of memory? The death, the very sudden death of Mark, discovered through his symbolic ringtone, reveals the sheer vulnerability of collective memory and national nostalgia towards the past in the presence of ruthless modernization. And the next character I want to talk about is the mid-aged woman who, I don't know whether she's the prostitute or she just facilitates, guys with the other woman, but she decided to move to Guangzhou at the end as arranged by the government, and I think she represents another way of dealing with loss, which I describe as a fatalistic way of confronting the loss, a more passive path, which is taken actually by the majority of the people who had to migrate. There are 1.3 million people who had to migrate, by the way. That's a lot. And the kind of intensity, the kind of, the volume of the people are not shown in this film. But I think the film kind of adopts a very subtle way to look at, the empty village after everybody has disappeared. So when Sanmin, at the dock, asked her, okay, so why are you going to Guangzhou? And she replied with 2 words, no choice. That's what she said. And I think many people accept loss as a lack of choice. There's no protest. Well, we saw a lot of fighting, but the majority of the people didn't protest. There's no resistance. Sometimes there's even no emotion. They ascribe the traumatic loss to fate. Fate, in this case, becomes the last resort the subject orients themselves to, because fate is always there. It's always there before they even come into the world. In another word, it will never be lost, and fate could justify for any type of loss. Before I move on to talk about the two main characters, Sanmin and Shenhong, I want to offer another interpretation of mourning and melancholy by Zizek. He translates Freud's definition in a more Lacanian sense. He said that what happens in melancholia is not that you lose the object. You have the object, but you lose the desire for the object. You lose the object cause of desire. Everything's there, you lose the desire for it. So the true lost object in melancholy is the desire. Therefore, melancholy always comes before mourning. Mourning only occurs when the object is lost, but melancholy occurs sometimes before the object is lost. And I think his understanding of melancholy is best exemplified by the different responses to loss between Sanmin, the male character, and the female character. It's easy to read Sanmin's story as a loss regain. He lost his wife and daughter 16 years ago and decided to return to his wife's hometown to unite with his daughter. However, I want to offer another way of looking at Sanmin's story. To me, all of the stories are about loss. But I think Sanmin's story is the only one that's not about loss, but rather about hope. Tracing back to 16 years ago, his daughter came into this world shortly before his wife walked away with his daughter. For entirely 16 years, he has never looked for his wife or daughter. Even when his wife asked him that, he was silent. If it took him 16 years to realize this loss and to take action to look for it, then to me, the loss is never lost at the first place. He had already overcome the loss and accepted the disappearance of his wife and daughter 16 years ago. What drives him to this journey, to me, is not loss, but hope. Hope, in a form of an ideal abstraction of family, is the real motive for his action. The piece of paper with his wife's address is the only trace of hope, the hope for family, for children, for unity in general. It is not the desire for the lost family, which is formed 16 years ago, that eventually leads him to his reconciliation with his wife and daughter, but rather the desire and hope for an abstract idea of family, a family to be. Through the story of Sanmin, we can recover more optimism in this film, the desire for a home, for a family, for a community, or for a better country is what drives people to work through the grief of loss, to continue to live, to work through the process of mourning. Mourning in this case embodies both loss and hope, and both lack and desire. Shan Huang, the female character, her story resembles her journey of mourning as well. She's putting an end to her 2-year mourning. For 2 years, she's been struggling with her lost husband. Her personal story simplified the story of many people at the site. The object has not lost yet. The buildings are still there. The reality hasn't come. People are caught in between the past and the future. They're struggling to establish a new relation to the to-be-lost object. People take on new path of life. They take on new jobs, become, even fighting to take people out of their house. But they're still there. They are still not completely away from the past. They're still lingering in their hometown. What made these people stay in the hometown? It's easy to read them as survival. They need to work, they need to survive. Seems like the main motive behind their action. But for me, the deeper motive is actually mourning, as a process of detaching themselves slowly through reorientation. There's a need for Shen Hong to see her husband in person and to find evidence of his affairs, to see the reality of loss, and to put an action to her mourning. People who stay at the site, they need to see their home disappear. They need to see the loss of the object in reality. As San Min's co-worker says, we'll go to Shanxi and work in a mining job after this place is gone. We have to finish up the work here, even though we're getting paid less. Life continues, but mourning takes time. We linger to our past, both after and during the process of disappearance. Shen Huang, at the end, she saw the ruined building taking off like a spaceship into the air. The use of the UFO and the rocket-like building, according to the director, he actually said this in an interview, represents the quick destruction of a 2,000-year-old town. That's his own word. And he said, quote, director said, "It's as if there was an alien invasion." And I think that's part of the reason he's putting those kind of alien out-of-space elements into the space. But for me, it also speaks to the hysteria and absurdity of China's modernization. To put everything into perspective of China's modern history, this kind of traumatic changes and social transformation is nothing. Everything happened in the frame of a second, like a rocket taking off. Eventually, everything will disappear. The history, the culture, the tradition, they will all disappear like a rocket. Individual mourning is dismissed. Everything will disappear so fast, like the taking off of a spaceship. Mourning is nothing but a subjective prolonging of this taking off. Lastly, I see a lot of similarity again between the stranger in Zimo's sense and the mourner in Freud's sense. Mourning implies both attachment and detachment. It's the working through loss and grief. The subjects have to fully engage the loss before they can accept it and to reorient themselves to loss. In Zimo's word, mourning embodies both intimacy and distance, both nearness and remoteness. A mourner is similar to a stranger in the sense that both have to engage the space, be it socially or psychologically, as a way of working through it and reestablishing distance and objectivity in this relation. Drifting in the uncertainty of China's modernization, people constantly experience a sense of loss. And the saddest thing about China's modernity is the dismissal of individual mourning. How each individual struggles through their time and history in the wave of social change is a much more powerful story than the growing number of GDP. And director Jia Zhangke, through his film Still Life, tells us a very powerful story about individual and collective mourning and offers me, at least, and hopefully for all of you, another way of relating to China's modernization. Thank you. So, 24 minutes, I'm good on time.
Good on time.